this. All right, Doug, I think we're recording. Yep, we're good to go. How's it going? Being on the other side of the country.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're here. And when you sent me, or your assistant, whoever sent me all your stuff, like I was saying kind of before we started recording that, I knew of tall poppy syndrome. Well, I take that back. I knew what the definition of tall poppy syndrome is, but I didn't know they actually had an official name of what it was. So let's start this off kind of, giving everyone a background of what tall poppy syndrome is, a definition, and then maybe a little bit brief about yourself, your background and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think it's good just to understand the metaphor, and then we'll go into my background and how I was tall poppied, and then my quest to understand the syndrome better, and how the simple concept really isn't as simple as you think, and then how you can understand society and yourself better once you understand this, because it's emotional driven.
Sure.
So the basic metaphor, the tall poppy syndrome, is seeing a field of poppies and seeing one taller than the other and wanting them to cut that down so that all are equal. That's the basic concept that actually was described by Livy, the great Russian or Roman historian.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, one of the best examples is Caesar himself being cut down. So it was described by Livy, but it was actually originally described by Herodotus, the Greek historian, the father of history. And in that case, the description was of wheat fields and cutting the heads off of the wheat.
Right.
So I don't like that one as much. And I really like the Roman interpretation, one, because Rome was founded in 750 BC, and it went through 7 kingdoms. And the last kingdom was Tarquin the Proud, and pride is going to be very important. So we're going to go back to that later on. But Tarquin sent his son Sextus to the neighboring town to rule it, Gabii. And he was having a difficult time ruling the city. So he sent a messenger back to his dad on how to manage it. And his dad took the messenger to a field of poppies and lopped off the tall ones. The messenger went back to Sextus and told him what happened. And he knew immediately that he had to cut down the opposing heads of the opposition within the city. And that was the true first description of the tall poppy syndrome, and by Livy in ancient Rome. And it helps to think of Julius Caesar is one of the people being tall poppied. In ancient Greece, Socrates was tall poppied. So it started very early in Western civilization. So we can segue into my little life, and then my journey after I felt that I was tall poppied, or I was actually told I was tall poppied.
Let's stay with the history real quick, because I have a question on that.
Okay.
From my background that I did read up, it started out in Rome. Well, what you just said, the exact story in Rome, but it was also talked about being very common in New Zealand and Australia. And I don't know if that was a part of certain culture or what.
Right. So in the English-speaking countries, that's most common in Australia and New Zealand. And the reason for that is that Australia was founded as a penal colony for England. And the culture of the penal colony are all people are equal. And that's the culture within Australia today. And anytime you have equity more than equality, really, anytime people are equal, there's more problems. So in the legal, if you're in prison and everybody's equal, if somebody has a phone and you don't have it, it drives the other prisoners crazy.
Sure.
And that's driven by the emotion envy, the comparison envy. So you're comparing yourself to somebody else. Envy itself is broken into two components. Aristotle was actually the first back in ancient Greece to define envy and break it into good and bad. Good envy is if I see you and I covet something that you have, but I want to improve myself so that I'm equal to you.
That
And
makes sense.
that used to be what America was about. Bad envy is, for whatever reason, I don't feel I can do that. So instead of trying to improve myself, I want to degrade you in one form or another. Active degradation would be something to harm you or to key your car. Passive would be to do disparaging remarks
Right.
to people. So envy is the driving force of what I now call peer-to-peer tall poppy syndrome, because the tall poppy syndrome occurs within peer groups. And that's why it's so prevalent in Australia, because that's a culture of their society, and New Zealand as well. Canada is not far back because it's also a very egalitarian country. And to a certain extent, before London went over this transformational stage, now London is 1/3 outsiders or non-English people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the country itself used to be very egalitarian as well. Once you got rid of the kingdoms, just like Rome, because when the Tarquin the Great or the Proud eventually had to step down because of bad things happening in his kingdom, it became a republic. And the republic started in 500 BC and would go, of course, till after Caesar was killed and began essentially at 0 BC or AD. But Caesar crossed the Rubicon, which became a famous time. And once you cross the Rubicon with your troops, was coming out of Gaul, then that was against Roman law, and that threw the country into civil war. That's eventually led up to Caesar being cut down. But back to more present day, the more equal the countries are, theoretically, the more tall poppy syndrome exists, because, as I mentioned, it occurs really in peer-to-peer groups. So if we look at egalitarian countries, it's going to be big in Holland, which Holland has a saying, the tall tree captures all the wind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's big in the Nordic or Scandinavian countries because they are all very egalitarian too. So the more equal you are, it's hard on people to see somebody advance, and especially if they feel they can't advance.
There's a UFC fighter who he's from New Zealand, and Israel Adesanya, I think is his name. And he actually, the reason I asked about Australia, New Zealand, I think what you're saying, it was very, I guess New Zealand culture's very equal, so to speak.
It's similar to
Yeah, and like where he was from there, and he was actually getting an award, or he was talking about something. He kind of made a thing about tall poppy syndrome and said, "Hey, let's all stop trying to cut each other down and actually help each other and stuff." And he says that's what I wanted to promote. So that's the reason. But I never knew New Zealand was like that or had that much, I guess, envy within them.
No, in fact, I took a year to do research the world literature on the tall poppy syndrome, and by far and away, New Zealand and Australia come up number one in research articles. I mean, they spend a lot of time defining the problem and how to solve the problem. So it's in the English-speaking countries, it's most prevalent there. And if you want to know more about it, the scientific articles, I mean, when I looked at America, there wasn't even a scientific article on it.
Correct. That's when I was looking up things, I couldn't find much about America. It was always either Australia, New Zealand. I think there was something small about Japan too, but I can't remember.
Well, Japan, once again, is egalitarian. It's completely egalitarian. I'm trying to go to Japan in a month, and I'm telling you, it's a big hassle. That country is so rigid on everything else and wants to keep everything the same. You
Mm,
know, for a CEO in Japan to make over $1 million is an exception.
really?
That's why, yeah,
I
they,
didn't.
they control everything. They want everybody equal. And so they're saying is the tall nail gets pounded down. That's the Japanese saying.
What's the benefit of having an equal society like that? Is there?
Well, I can't figure out. I don't know one. I mean, all the the communistic countries are all equal, right? You have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. You have the upper class, which is the ruling class, and everybody else is the equal. And as far as I'm concerned, that's really a form of bullying, because the bullying is a little different from the um, tall poppy syndrome, because the bullying usually involves people of one level picking on people of a lower level.
Sure.
There's a discrepancy between the two, and it's ongoing. I mean, the bully picks out somebody that they're going to bully, usually somebody lower than themselves that they can feel good about. It gives them more self-esteem, and they continue that over and over and over. That's not the case of the tall poppy syndrome. It's boom, I'm tall poppied and he's done. So before we do too much, I'll just tell you about then the public tall poppy syndrome is more aligned with the metaphor. So the tall poppy syndrome, true tall poppy, involves a public figure, somebody that you and I couldn't cut down because we don't have the power
Sure.
to cut them down. They actually cut themselves down. So the tall poppy in America is the CEO of a company. It's the media personalities. It's Hollywood. It's movie stars. It's professional athletes. So in our society, that is the tall poppy. Now, interestingly enough, they usually cut themselves down. And why do they cut themselves down? The number one emotion is pride, hubris, excessive pride. Once again, pride can be good or bad. Pride of ownership is good. We like that, but we don't like somebody that gets too big for their britches. So
Well,
pride is number one reason for a company to fall, for a CEO to fall, for an athlete to fall. For we can go into Chris Rock and Will Smith in a minute, but
is it one of them things that if you get to the top of whatever your craft, the CEO, that it's almost so much stress of being at the top and holding that position, you is one reason why you probably would cut yourself down, that you just can't handle it anymore?
well, the Dutch say the tall wind captures the tall tree captures all the wind, and that's really a wonderful metaphor, because anytime you do start to stick out, there's going to be people come at you from all sides. So look at Elon Musk. You can't get much taller than that guy right now, and everybody is coming at him from all sides. So the taller you get, it does expose you. But just like a Hollywood star or an athlete aging, you do. Uh, I actually have a saying for Hollywood. I act, therefore I am.
Mm,
Sooner or later, they think that because they can act, then everybody knows who they are. Then they're an expert on the environment
sure.
and every other thing that's wrong with America. And
There's
so
a
it's that excessive pride that gets in their way.
Yeah, there's another story related to what you're saying, and it was about Jordan Peterson was talking about it, and I forgot who he picked it up from, but it was about zebras being in a herd together, where you don't think they really can be camouflage themselves, just because like to our eyes that we all know that it's a zebra there, but when you look down and you look up, you're trying to pick out a specific one, you can't really tell anymore. But I can't remember if there was somebody studying the zebras or what, but they went up and started marking them with red paint, or like clipping their ear like they do with cows. And then lions were able to pick out like a single one. They couldn't, take down a herd, but they could pick out the single one because they had some kind of mark on them and they stood out more.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of studies on that. I think one of the pervasive feelings now is if you look at the wagon wheel and it looks like it's going in reverse instead of going forward, when the horses are pulling it and you look at
Yeah.
the wheel.
Yep.
And so it's that contrast of the different stripes moving not in unison that blinds the lion or tiger so that they can't estimate the speed. So that's just like the wagon wheel going backwards. If you look at it, if you're as an adult, we know, but if you're a young kid and you see that wagon for the first time and the wheel going backwards and you think the body was going forward, it's very confusing to you. So
Mm.
I think that's one of the, I
Okay.
agree with, I think the herd, anytime you have a bigger mass, that's a problem. I mean, even for an elephant, if all the people can herd together, that's going to be a bigger problem for them. So I think mass is one, but I think one of the things on the lions was they can't get those stripes, whether they're going forward, backward, or the exact speed.
For
And
sure.
that's confusing to them.
For sure.
But anyway, if we get back to the peers, to the peer-to-peer, which
Yep.
was the most interesting to me. So listen, it begins in your family when you grow up. So your parents trying to keep everybody equal. I was from a family of 7 kids. And so my parents tried to spend the same amount of money on us,
Mm.
the same amount of clothes, try and do, same birthday party. We only got a birthday party when we were 5 and maybe 10 or 11 or some set number. And the rest of the family, whoever they did that first, then everybody else had to do that.
Right.
So and Cain and Abel, of course, in the Bible, it doesn't take very long for the Bible to describe familial envy. So that occurs very early in our childhood. And then, of course, when we get in the schools, especially now in America, we used to have the valedictorians and the people that stood out. But the tendency now is everybody gets a trophy. So the schools are trying to, what some people say, dumb down and make everybody equal.
Mm-hmm.
And that unfortunately is continuing now even into our college. So we get into that very early on, and that kind of programs our thinking. But then when we get into the workforce, then the meritocracy kicks in. And anytime you have competition, you're going to have the tall poppy syndrome because you're competing with somebody else to go up the next rung of the ladder.
Right.
As you do that, if you don't think your CV is as good as the other person's, then you're going to resort the old-fashioned way of trying to cut them down some way so that you improve your own chances. So that's the workplace where the more meritocracy you have in your workplace, the more um, tall poppy syndrome you'll see. And I'm a physician, and theoretically, dentists and attorneys and physicians and pharmacists, we're supposed to be so-called professionals. But I guarantee you that it's more prevalent in the professionals than it is in society because our workplace is so intense. You're with a high bunch of overachievers and they're all competing. You compete for patients, you compete to be the fastest surgeon. Your
Sure.
whole life is you're competing to be smart and to be the most up-to-date physician in your area. So the competition is intense from getting into medical school, in medical school, and getting into your residency, into your practice, and trying to stay alert and obtain patients.
Yeah. I mean, I could imagine that just, from base, everything that I've seen growing up and, going through, my bachelor's and my master's degree that, there's always those people, like you said, overachievers. And then especially when you go into the medical field that, oh, you got to be the number one surgeon, you got to be the number one at the top of your class, number one. But not only that, like, when you was talking about growing up, I came from, just a small family, but my parents did the same thing as far as equal everything, it's equal clothes, but just in a different color. We spent the same amount of money on you as we did your brother for Christmas. And I get it. I understand that. I didn't want to show favoritism. I mean, there's even, some lines to be drawn with that when coaching athletes. You don't want to show one athlete more favoritism than the other. But I guess my point is that, when you start to outshine and learn that, you're gifted in a certain way and coming up, and that it's almost that you almost try to be more reserved in your skills and your mindset, that you don't want to be, at the top of everything because you're almost afraid of, being tall poppy, and that, you'd be cut down, and you don't want that, but I guess that stress on you or that burden on you, that you're, even though that you're really good, other people are coming for you and you have that target on your back.
Yeah, it holds men back, but I think it's more prevalent in females.
Really?
Well, because they don't have, the female is not as prideful as the male. They're not as aggressive. I mean, if you look in the entire animal kingdom, it's like that.
I agree.
So the female, I call it compliant. I don't like the word passive, but they're more compliant and they're not as aggressive. And the syndrome is actually more prevalent in the female because they look at this whole thing a little differently. I'll tell you a study and why I think the way I do, and it's backed up by Canada, which we've already mentioned as being a egalitarian society. Canada females actually there's a national program put on annually for the tall poppy syndrome for women who have been tall poppied in the workplace. And this is a fascinating study that comes from Australia. It has to do with bullying. And the study was set up to ask the best athletes in a school, male and female, if they had been bullied during their schooling. And zero of the boys said they had been bullied.
Okay.
And why do you think that is?
Just because none of the boys being bullied? I don't know.
Well, don't you think that's part of our growing up? I was bullied. Everybody in my family was bullied growing up. It's not. Sometimes it's bullied by your older brother. Sometimes, I had to walk to school. There were always kids waiting for me to walk by and throw rocks at me when I went by. So bullying is a big part of the male experience in growing up. There's always bullies.
True.
If you're on peer with somebody in your own grade, there's still an upper level guy who has low self-esteem because he's not anybody in his class, but he's above you. And so the upperclassman is going to pick on a lower classman. Once again, there's a discrepancy in power.
Right. I agree.
In the bullying situation, much more than the so-called tall poppy syndrome. So in the study, every female felt they were bullied, which is just a fascinating statement of our society, of their society, and the way men interpret things versus the same situation in women interpreting things. So, well, it just shows you how divergent we've become as a society in America because, the blacks are going to interpret an experience one way because of race. Women are going to experience something in a similar situation, maybe gender-based or feminism, and the white male is going to differentiate that in a completely different way, which brings up a major point of how fluid the true tall poppy is, because your tall poppy is not necessarily my tall poppy.
That's what I was thinking, correct.
So, well, that became a big part of my book, was to find to compartmentalize the tall poppy syndrome, because first of all, there's a difficulty in saying who's the tall poppy. So certainly a figure like Donald Trump, he's going to be a tall poppy, I don't know if half the country, but certainly he's a short poppy to more than half the country. So just to have to agree on what a tall poppy is, which I eventually spent a third of the original draft of the book was spent trying to define what a tall poppy was. At the conclusion of the book, I felt the best way to be a tall poppy, and if you wanted to be recognized as a tall poppy, was to be a servant of mankind, so that you didn't have gender issues, you didn't have racial issues, that you were trying to serve mankind. And if you were doing that, somehow working, I mean, you can do that even as a postman. So if you're the postman, and I mean, my postman, actually, she's a woman. She's a wonderful lady. She gives us first class experience with regular postage. If we get a box, she doesn't want to leave it on the step so somebody else can pick it up. She knocks on our door, rings the doorbell to give us that box personally so nobody else can take it. And I know it's just not me. She does it for the whole neighborhood. So that's how you can be a servant, even in society, or, you know, if you're in a restaurant serving people, I mean, is to just treat people the way they should be treated. That's servitude, and you can do that from your podcast or no matter what you do in life. So
do you know what
if you're,
do you know what the dark sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but do you know what the dark triad is?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So those three elements, I mean, you know, in discussing like who or might be a tall poppy, do you think a person who is a tall poppy possesses those three traits?
Well, repeat them for the audience.
So okay, that's probably good. That's a good idea. So for those who don't know what the dark triad is you possess three traits, and are, I guess, can be argued dark traits, but narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism.
And if you look at most tall poppies, so let's use Steve Jobs as a case, as an example, because he's a dark triad, and almost all our if you go back in our history to the robber barons, every one of them was a dark triad. Almost all our people in Silicon Valley were dark triads. So if we look at Steve Jobs, when in his first career, he tried to cheat Wozniak out of his Apple shares, and he was very tough on people. And guess what? He got tall poppy. Now, the sociopathic personality or trait, you know, there's a difference in psychology when you have a trait versus the actual diagnosis. So a psychopath, we're not labeling Steve Jobs as a psychopath.
No.
We're saying he has a sociopathic personality. Most people grow out of that. If you look at all the robber barons, every one of them grew out of it. You know, Carnegie, what did he do with all his money? He gave it to libraries. So the Rockefeller Foundation set up the Rockefeller Foundation. So sooner or later, they grow out of that. But those dark triad traits, to a certain extent, help you become aggressive and overcome obstacles.
Correct.
And when you look at I think it's a good philosophical question, were the robber barons good or bad for America? I mean, they were bad people. They were monopolies. They were bad to all their workers. You know, they created low wages, and they busted unions and things. So they had a lot of negative traits. But I mean, Standard Oil, and to put America on the top for production of oil, you have to give them a lot of credit. So I cut people a lot more slack than some of our present cancel culture, because even if you look microscopically at me, you can find bad traits in everybody, but you have to cast a wide net on how you interpret people's lives. So back to Steve Jobs, of course, he got cut down, right? The board of directors kicked him out. And it was during that he probably had a good growing phase when he developed the next two companies, and he came back to Apple and took it to great heights. So frequently the process, we can go back to a second on the bullying. The problem with the bullying behavior in the male is that becomes innate to them and they don't understand their behavior. They're not aware of it unless somebody calls them out.
Right.
Oh,
I agree.
in Steve Jobs' case, for example, he to a certain extent got called out, and he's a very insightful man. So whether it was just his age, um, as I say, many people do grow out of the sociopathic situation, whether it was age and growing out or is introspected and starting two other companies. But he came back to Apple as a brand new guy and took it to great heights. So sometimes being tall poppied can be very, very good. In fact, when I was tall poppied, it became a flashpoint in my life, and I did a lot of introspection and actually wrote the book. I spent 5 to 10 years of my life understanding the tall poppy syndrome. But of course, who grew the most out of that situation is not going to be any reader of my book. It's going to be me. So being tall poppied is not necessarily a bad thing. The thing of the tall poppy, as I was saying, the peer-to-peer, it's usually the envier, the cutter, who is the person at fault. And the cutter is driven mostly by bad envy, usually driven by anger, as we saw in the Chris Rock, Will Smith. Will Smith was angry, but he was also excessively prideful to think that he could even do that. And the last thing that we talk about, or that I talk about, is laziness. Some people just don't want to improve themselves. They want to be a victim, especially in America. The victim card is prevalent now. So how do they win? They cut people down. So on the cutter side, the three main emotions involved are envy, bad envy, anger, and then laziness. That's in deference to the true tall poppy in the public situation, where it's the tall poppy themselves that are cutting themselves down. The public feels justified in cutting them down because of their bad behavior. Either they were prideful, which is the most common case and frequently blends in to the other. It's also greed, and it's also lust. So if you look at almost every media person that was cut down since the Me Too movement, all three of those were involved: power or pride,
Yeah.
lust, and greed. So they're very common. The people, the tall poppies frequently cut themselves down um, through their own devices. Those are the three most common emotions involved. And then the public looks at them and thinks that they're no longer justified to be tall poppies, and they need to be cut down to size. That's the syndrome. But the amazing thing is, once you start understanding, you can interpret China now trying to already cut down Hong Kong, and now they're cutting down Taiwan. So Russia's cutting down. It starts at the countries. So Russia's now trying to cut down Ukraine, and to a certain extent, Putin wants to cut down Zelensky, because Zelensky, Ukraine has been very, very politically not up to par, so a lot of corruption. So Zelensky was actually a rapid rising star and pro-democracy. And of course, that in itself was a huge threat to Putin. So on a personal level, Putin could have been very interested in cutting down Zelensky. So it starts at the country level, can go to the personal level. And then, of course, we get down once again to our peer-to-peer. So once you understand the syndrome and some of the emotions involved, then you're able to interpret the situation as you evaluate it. Just as you heard about that wrestler, but you also have to be careful. I mean, Will Smith had a lot of people on his side. So there's a lot of bias in the observers. So during this process, you're actually learning more, as much about yourself and your interpretation of all this as you are looking at what's happening. And if you were to look at some of the evaluations or reviews on the book on Amazon, the readers were very keen on pointing that out, that they didn't read this book for the idea of it being a self-help book, but as you understand the world, you understand your own self in respect to the world. So it's a self-help concept.
Where you start to look at, how you've treated others and how, I was, and what you've done through your life path compared to, someone else's life path, and, seeing somebody get ahead of them, or, have a lot of fortune come to them, be one of the number one in their field, it creates, one of the, the bad envy, even though you can easily use that and make the good envy, and just like, that's what motivates me. It's just like, oh, I see somebody doing really good for themselves. I don't want to play the victim card. I want that, oh, I'd love to see people do really good for themselves. But that bad envy, it's so easy in today's times, like you were saying, for people to play that victim card, like, oh, well, he's able to do that because, he was born with, money in his bank, or he had rich parents, or he was just automatically, 6'6" tall, and that's why he's a great basketball player. And it's always easy to play that, victim mentality, when it's rather just, if somebody took all the amount of energy they're doing and trying to cut somebody down, or getting on Twitter, just writing hateful comments to that one person, if they turn that around and just put it towards, hey, I'm going to do something positive with my life and try to get onto that level rather than just cut somebody down. I mean, what does somebody get out of that?
Well, I have to give you an A, because you're already getting the concept and doing your own self-evaluation. And most people don't even understand envy, that there's, I mean, I think love's the most important emotion, but I think the most prevalent emotion is envy, because it's always on. Every time you
Sure.
look at somebody, that's envy. You're evaluating. It's subconscious. You may not necessarily be aware of it, but I mean, your whole contact experience with society is envy, and most people don't realize that it's good envy and bad envy. And I have to tell you, from my own experience and what happened, I mean, I grew up, as we were talking, in a small farm town, 400 people. I did go to Des Moines, Iowa, to high school in a all-boy school, and there were 200 in my class. So I was starting at the bottom. So I figured out who was smart, and I hung out with them to learn their good habits.
Gonna do it.
And I did the same thing then in college, and that got me into medical school. My sophomore year, I lived with two guys, and both of them were within the top 5 of my medical school class. So I wanted to surround. I mean, you're not going to learn anything if you think you're going to improve your esteem by playing tennis with somebody that's worse than you are. You got to play somebody better than you are, so that you can improve. So the whole concept is that's why we actually used to have statues before they tore all of them down, was so that we would see heroes and people of high esteem, so that we could understand who they were and try and mimic what they did or their good points. So you're understanding the good envy, which I didn't even understand. I went through my whole life, fortunately, for the most part, I think, practicing good envy, and then um, understanding bad envy. And if I hadn't written the book, I would have not understood my own behavior. In fact, it was getting cut down, that I had to, just like the bully guy that I mentioned. So I had to be cut down before I did any self evaluation. And lo and behold, I was happy that I had practiced so much good envy through my life, and couldn't see the bad envy that other people were seeing in me when they cut me down. But
Hmm.
that's what I say. Once you understand this, you'll understand yourself. And I agree exactly how you just made the statement of how you always wanted to improve yourself, and you admired people, and
Mm-hmm.
to think of cutting them down seems so foreign to you. And when you look, I mean, the internet and social media is the purveyor is bad envy. I mean, it's just exactly what you described. It
Yeah.
is people cutting other people down. It's become the national pastime, just like the tall poppy syndrome is in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I had to learn, through my life path. I just sit and I was probably, if you go ask myself in high school, 15, 20 years ago, whenever I was there, then, what I was like in college, I was probably one of those guys like, oh, he was, he only got to where he was just because of X, Y, and Z, and it wasn't until I, started to learn what, taking hard work and, sacrifices and, you know, taking, the right paths and hanging out with the right people, like you said, and learning like, okay, this is just not, just any, there a little, maybe a little bit of luck too, but it's one of these things where you have to work for what you get or what you want, what you put into something, I firmly believe is what you get out of it. And, you start to reevaluate things and start to, especially COVID helped me out too. It's just like, I always think we live on momentum and we stop and I could take reflects and like, ooh, where am I at? Have I met my life goals? Is this where I plan on my life being or wanting to go? And you just spin it around. I mean, plus I don't like being a negative person, and, I want, like you said, like love is a great emotion. And I agree 100% with that. If you have hate in your heart and your head, I mean, what kind of life is that? Just hating on people all the time. I mean, it's no fun to live your life like that.
Well, and the worst part, you're going to drift towards other people that think like that, and then that when that happens, your history.
And one thing Roosevelt said, I can't remember when I heard this quote, and you probably heard it too, but they said comparison's a thief of joy. And once I learned that, comparing myself to others, and why am I not this way? Why didn't I get the promotion? Why didn't I get the degree? Whatever you want to say, that it was like, oh, you got to live your own life, dude, and find out what's working out for you. And just because you're comparing yourself to this person, they may did a couple things differently and worked harder for you or worked for them. Like that worked for them. Maybe it's going to not work for you, but you need to do things this way, and also one of those things that you're the average of the 5 people you hang out with the most,
Yeah. I mean, that's the one I like. And that's what when things aren't right, the first thing you have to self-reflect, and in that self-reflection is the group that you're hanging out with.
Sure.
That becomes part of the reflection. But um, even even when you're describing what you just described, the whole thing of self-reflection, it's very, when you're in a fight and you're having problems with people, it's very hard to judge. It's just as you say, you have to have COVID to step back out of everything, and then you can see things more clearly. When you're in the heat of the fight, like I think that was part of Will Smith's problem, was his hubris and his anger, and it was just driving him that he's got to do something.
Yeah.
And the thing he had to do was just don't do something, stand there, and then if he had just done that, everything would have passed. And there's another message. There's probably a lot of other messages in that, but one of the other messages is in that, which is the subject we're talking about, is revenge. And there's a saying, if you seek revenge, dig 2 graves. And the meaning of that is that there's so much negativity that you're going to generate in order to get back at that individual who think that wronged you, that you're going to be way worse off, even if you are able to achieve what you perceive to be as some victory. You will have lost, because the negativity that you have generated is going to far outweigh anything that you gain. And so that's a road that should never be taken.
No, I agree 100% with that. And, just so everyone knows, and I know we kind of touched on it in the beginning or right there a little bit ago, but, you were actually tall poppy. And I don't know if you actually explained your story of being tall poppy, and if you want to do that,
Well, it's of interest mostly, your show's about the hows and the whats and whys. And so I came from this small town, and I eventually ended up in Los Angeles. I was a full professor of clinical orthopedics at USC, and had published over 110 scientific articles. And I was head of a spinal cord injury unit at one of the premier centers in the country, based there in Downey, California, which is part of LA County. I was president of the America Spinal Injury Association at that time. And I'd run 3 other services at the rehabilitation center. And when I left one service, I always put a figurehead chief in, and I became umbrella chief. So in this particular hospital, which was 180 beds, I was umbrella chief of 150. And I had gone away to a meeting, um, and there was an Australian there, and we were cementing plans for me to spend a 6-week sabbatical in Australia to visit 6 of their rehabilitation centers, their spinal cord injury units. And when I got back from that meeting, there was a note on my door, which was the premier office in our hospital, that my office had been moved down from the premier office to a little cubbyhole at the end of the hall. And I went home and told my wife what happened. And at the time that it happened, I forget the name of the book, but Who Moved My Cheese, or something about somebody's moved your cheese. Your cheese has been moved, so you've got to find a different path to find it, to go through the maze. So she said, somebody's moved your cheese. And, that turned on the light bulb right away. And she was not in the battle. So I would have gone back up for a pissing contest, gotten a big fight, tried to find out who did it to me, tried to get my office back, done all these random, dumb, revenge-driven things. And thanks to her, she said, you're just going to go back there tomorrow. You're going to resign, and you're going to take Fridays off, and we're going to enjoy LA. She was working as a nurse, and she said she would take Fridays off, and we'd see LA and enjoy our personal life. And then I could enjoy my other professional life, which was private practice. I was doing all this rehabilitation and all this academic stuff on borrowed time. So it was a workaholic time and cheating really my private practice. So I never did enjoy my private practice. So it allowed me really to enjoy my wife in LA and to enjoy my private practice. I called Australia, and I talked to this person and said, I'm not coming. There's been a change of plans. And of course, they were upset, and why. And I explained what happened. And she said, well, you've been tall poppied. And I said, what? And she go, you've been tall poppied. And I couldn't get my head around that term.
Sure.
I said, I'm sorry, I just can't understand this. So she tried to explain it. And I sort of got the idea. But then I practiced, did my private practice for 10 more years, and I kind of had this whole thing in my head the whole time. So then when I retired, then I spent 1 year just in the library researching the tall poppy syndrome worldwide, and found it in all countries, all cultures, from pretty much the beginning of time. It's rampant in the Bible, in fact. But anyway, then I wrote the book. So for me, it was a life-changing event. It was a very positive thing. But that's the story, and that's how the book was written. And for America itself, I originally thought that America was protected because there was nothing written about the tall poppy syndrome in the literature.
Sure.
And I thought, how can that be? So my premises of the book was that it was our individualism and the worship of the individual, just what you and I were talking about, of finding some individual that we worshiped and trying to emulate him. And in fact, when Einstein first came to America, Einstein, was Jewish and had a lot of problems because of that. And he was so smart, and he did theoretical physics instead of empirical. And there's always a problem with the guy that's got to work out the formulas versus the guy who can just think of the formula. So if there was a guy at 24 who knew bad envy, it was Albert Einstein. First time he came to America, the first thing he remarked was, this is a country free of envy. And it's an unbelievable remark that somebody like him could make that, just arriving at America and evaluating its people. Of course, I think I can do that now because I've studied it so much. But anyway, that was my premise for the book. And then once I came to the conclusion of the book, I felt that America was the king of the tall poppy syndrome because as I broke it down, we have more tall poppies than any other country because of our capitalism and our meritocracy. So we create the tall person that's capturing all the wind, and nobody's perfect. So if you there, as I said, unless you can serve people as Sister Teresa did, it's very hard to be a tall poppy and not offend somebody. And we all have faults. Everybody has faults. So there's room. If you want to look, you can find somebody's tall poppy and cut them, have a reason to cut them down.
Yeah.
So that I had to. So I had to change the conclusion of the book. It was because of our individualism and our meritocracy, because of the competition, that it was more prevalent here. We had the true tall poppies, and we had the victims and our division in the country, and now now it's hard to grow tall without being cut down, and within our peer group it's hard to, I mean, if you're in that group of 5 you're talking about, which is frequently divided by your social economic group, you're all making about the same. I mean, I'm probably not going to hang out with somebody that 5 guys that have 100 million in the bank, for example. So even if I think I'm intellectually comparable to them, I'm just not going to make it.
Yeah.
So even within your own group, it's now politically to just be divided by some insignificant thing that doesn't even count, that you cut each other down. So we need to understand the tall poppy syndrome ourselves emotionally and act accordingly. Good envy.
Do you think that it's almost in today's society, just talk about America and cancel culture and political or politics, that it's almost a game for certain groups to go after somebody to cancel them?
Oh, of course it. Well, they can't do it. They can't do it. I mean, I like movements. I mean, nothing is given to people for nothing. I mean, that's why you need good envy to emulate, because the downtrodden don't understand that even short of people inheriting things, but most people have to earn their reputation or their money or do something.
Sure.
Nobody's giving stuff for nothing. And if you are part of the downtrodden, it is very hard to escape. And to a certain extent, the only way you can do that is with a movement of some sort, like feminism, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. So I like movements. I understand movements. I think movements are good for society. But unfortunately, it seems in America, we've gone too far. I don't want to say to the right because it's too far to the left or what, but we've gone too far on all this, and we need to cut each other a break.
You think that's the future?
No, it'll run its course. I mean, if you look at our history, the 1900s were terrible. In that time during the Industrial Revolution, the 30s were terrible. If you remember, we'd come through communism, and our first flirting with socialism and communism was happening in the 20s and 30s. Was really a terrible time to some extent. And I lived through the 60s, and we're not even close to what the 60s were with the riots and the burning of cities and the taking over of universities and stuff. So it runs about a 50 to 70 year course that we go through at turbulent times. So we're in one of those courses. And I think, I do think we lack leadership, but if you look back through our presidents, we've had a lot of terrible presidents. I mean, we've never been blessed with great leadership. We have great leadership periodically, and that's enough to carry us through. It's enough to found our country. It's enough to have a president like Lincoln. So we're fortunate that we do get somebody so stellar that they kind of help right our ship. But my own personal feeling is we've lacked some really good leadership recently, and that would probably help us quicker get out of our doldrums. But I mean, we are in a phase, and we've been through this phase in this century at least 2 times before. Well, the previous century we went through it twice at least, minimum. So yeah, I think it'll run its course. I mean, there's already a backlash. We want more law and order. I mean,
Yeah.
we want more of the basic things of Jefferson, who I can say his name, the idealized individual. I mean, I really, that's my favorite person who his concept was, and we're certainly lacking that now. But I don't know how much time we have. I do have one other hidden agenda, which is to discuss Schadenfreude. Do you know what that term is? Which is the end of the tall poppy syndrome.
Okay, let's go ahead.
So the Schadenfreude is an interesting concept. The Germans are interesting for a lot of reasons, but their vocabulary is very limited. So when they have a new idea, they take old words and add them together. So sometimes they have three words put together to describe a new meaning of life. So Schadenfreude is actually two German words put together, and one comes from joy, and one comes from pain. And so the concept of Schadenfreude is having joy from somebody else's pain. And of course, that's the tail end of the tall poppy syndrome, when you cut somebody down and their downfall is your joy or improves your self-esteem. And that's part of the definition of bad envy, is not necessarily just coveting somebody else's goods, but also destroying their happiness. So that Schadenfreude is actually feeling happy when somebody else has had some sort of misery. And I can tell you, I tracked on Google uh, the hits of Schadenfreude daily and the hits of the tall poppy syndrome. And when it came out that Trump had COVID, it was the most Schadenfreude hits on the internet that had ever happened. So that's another. It's also driven by bad envy. It's a kissing cousin to the tall poppy syndrome. And if you're enjoying Schadenfreude these days, you probably need to do a little self-reflection, because that's not good. You want to have empathy for people, not laugh at them for falling down. I mean, there is a good Schadenfreude. For example, if you're driving down in LA, one of our busiest freeways is the 405. So if you're driving down the freeway going to work and it's stop and go, there's always a jerk. We always associate them usually in a sports car or something, some fancy car, weaving in and out, making you hit the brakes and stuff. And then, you go down about 5 miles and there that idiot is pulled over to the side of the road, either by the highway patrol getting a ticket, or he's in a little fender bender and his fancy car is no longer so fancy. So there you are, you're laughing.
Yeah.
So I consider that a good Schadenfreude. And if you have that happen, you'll go to work and have one of your best days at work. You'll just treat everybody with respect and maybe make $1 million that day. But if you remember all our cowboy movies, the guy in the black hat and the guy in the white hat, and the white hat won, and the other guy was the bad guy, and the good guy triumphed. And in the old days, everybody left the movie theater with Schadenfreude. That's what made them happy. And the movie industry didn't always know the word for it, but certainly somebody like Frank Capra, if you understand any of Frank Capra's movies, you'll understand Schadenfreude every bit, because every one of Frank Capra's movies was the downtrodden or the weakened guy, or the tall poppy that had been tall poppied wins out. And every Frank Capra movie, you're going to leave feeling like $1 million. I
just wrote that down as a note so I could check some of that out.
Yeah, check it out. Well, It's a Wonderful Life by Jimmy Stewart. Fantastic movie. Jimmy Stewart's tall poppied. by Mr. Potter. Just watch this movie for all your listeners. If you want to see the tall poppy syndrome from Hollywood, and it comes out every Christmas. It's recycled, but look at It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy
I know what
Stewart.
you're talking about. Every Christmas.
Oh man,
Yeah.
that thing is fantastic. It's fantastic for being a tall poppy. It's fantastic for Mr. Potter, the opposite banker who was trying to bankrupt him and take over their firm. And it's fantastic for the ending is how everything turns out and how absolutely, and it's Christmas time, how well it makes you feel. And of course, Dickens is the same way. And with little tiny Tim at the end of A Christmas Carol. I mean, if you read that at this time, and after you understand our discussion today, you'll have a new understanding of classical books. I mean, I talk a little bit now about, not now, but with the same thing. One of the things I've had people say, your whole talk is so negative, but in medicine we learn more from disease, not from health. So,
True.
if you come in feeling good, why are you in here? How am I going to help you? So that doesn't count. So if you come in sick, I got to figure it out. I got to figure it out how I'm going to help you. So I think you do. I mean, there's 10,000 self-help books published every year, and 1/3 of my original book was self-help. When I figured out that I couldn't write the self-help book, because if there's 10,000 every year, there's a lot of inspiration, but no transformation. So I continued down the negative path, and then I came across Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and the opening of that book is all happy families are the same, and all unhappy families are different. And that's the huge learning experience for all of the listeners as well, is that not always do you learn. I mean, you want to see good people and emulate good people, but if you say, I'm going to analyze this good person, chances are that good person is going to be very similar to the next good person that you meet. That their habits of getting up early, of working hard, of being positive, all those things are going to be similar.
I agree.
So the happy person is good to emulate, but the unhappy person is good to study, and it's good for your own self-evaluation, because probably you've got some negative traits hanging out between your ears. And if you read the tall poppy syndrome, those will be opened up to you and you'll improve yourself.
Doug, I think we should take it home right there on that. So if people want to find the book, if they want to find you, anything you want to plug, feel free to do that.
So the website is Doug, DOUG, Garland, GARLAND, one word, .com. And the book's available. I actually have 10 articles. On the top right-hand side, there's all the things that are on my website. Actually, the website's fun to open up because you see this great peanut strip describing it in 1959, July of 59, this peanut strip, when Charles Schultz described the tall poppy syndrome. But on the upper right-hand side, there's Medium, which is my blog site. Most of my tweeting, I tweet about 3 or 4 articles a day. What I do, I still scan the English or the American magazines, newspapers, Time Magazine, New York Times, LA Times, and I look for examples of the tall poppy syndrome. And when I see them, I tweet it, which is how I wrote the book. That's how the mechanism of seeing it and get my feeling for what was happening in America. So the tweets are really very interesting. And the blogs, I don't blog now, I just don't have, but there's really good blogs. It's under Medium, which is Google's Medium site. And then Amazon is there. There's actually a very good entry-level podcast. I have a lot of podcasts, but the entry-level podcast is a whiteboard podcast. That's the most popular tall poppy syndrome podcast on YouTube, not in numbers, but it comes up first because it's very visual and explains the symptom a little differently, kind of what we talked about versus what other people talk about. So that's kind of fun. But you can just then go to Amazon and purchase the book. The audio is very outstanding. The audio sometimes outsells the written version. The gentleman who did the audio did a wonderful job. But anyway, they're available on Amazon, and there's some thoughtful reviews on the book on Amazon if you have trouble deciding. It's kind of a hard read because it's semi-academic, but if you can wade through it, I think you'll be a better person.
No, I agree 100%. So, well, Doug, thanks for being here, man. Thanks for doing this with me.
My pleasure. Enjoyed meeting you, being on your program.
Okay, folks, over and out. Be good to yourselves.